So, I want to welcome you to our event today. And first, we'll introduce ourselves. I'm Sandy Valenti from Emporia State University, and I'm an assistant professor here. And presenting with me is...
I'm Dr. Terri Summey, and I'm a professor here at Emporia State University. And currently, I am a research and instruction librarian in the university libraries and archives. So today we plan to cover a variety of topics in this webinar, beginning with a definition of emotional intelligence and the various models of emotional intelligence, especially the Baron model of emotional social intelligence. We will examine the research on emotional intelligence in libraries, especially the research regarding emotional intelligence in library leaders. And finally, we'll conclude with information on developing your own emotional intelligence. Yeah, next slide. So what is emotional intelligence? Salovey and Mayer developed the concept of emotional intelligence, coined the term in the late 80s, early 90s. They define emotional intelligence as the ability to recognize and understand one's own emotional state and the ability to control those emotions. Additionally, it's the ability to perceive the emotions of others and help them control their own emotions. Finally, it's the ability to be able to use that emotional knowledge and information constructively as they say, to promote emotional and intellectual growth. Salovey and Mayer viewed emotional intelligence as a subset of social intelligence. And there had been some research done, as you can see, in the 1920s and the 1920s with social intelligence. There's a variety of definitions of emotional intelligence, most of them looking at the model that they apply to it and the construct that's used to operationalize them. They all have several components in common, including that self-awareness of your emotional states, self-expression of those emotional states, interpersonal skills, the ability to understand others, and the ability to manage emotions in oneself and others, problem solving, and self-motivation. As you can see on the slide, the concept of emotional intelligence was popularized by Goleman in the mid-90s. And then emotional intelligence has its antecedents in Thorndike's concept of intelligence, which consists of three categories. So Thorndike didn't see intelligence just as a single thing. He saw it as the three various pieces, with mechanical, being able to work and do things with your hands, abstract, and so that would be the conceptual cognitive piece, and social intelligence. The latter involves the ability, as Thorndike saw it, to understand and manage people, along with being able to act wisely in human relations. Gardner, in the early 90s, then further developed this theory with his theory of multiple intelligences. Multiple intelligences is comprised of a spectrum. So Gardner didn't see intelligence just as one cognitive intelligence. He saw it as a spectrum. And so that spectrum was comprised of linguistic, musical, logical, mathematical, spatial, bodily, kinesthetic, and personal. And then he further divided personal intelligence into two aspects, interpersonal and interpersonal. So typically, emotional intelligence is divided into modules characterized by the instruments that are used to operationalize that concept. The two main types of instruments that are used are self-report and then a maximum performance-based measures. Most of the conceptualizations of emotional intelligence fall into these three models: the ability-based model, a trait-based model, or mixed models, which combines the two abilities and traits. The ability model is characterized, as I said, by those maximum performance-based measures, where they try to measure your performance on various tasks and assessments. Salovey and Mayer's four-branch, and then they added in Caruso later, four-branch ability model falls under an ability-based model. It is measured then by the MSC-EIT, which is the Mayer-Salovey-Caruso Emotional Intelligence Test, is what measures that one. The second model is trait-based. This is based off of Goldman's work, although there are several other models or tests that kind of fall into this. His is kind of the most well-known, which is measured by the Emotional Competence Inventory. And then finally, the final model is the mixed model, which is the model that I utilized more for the research that I did that we'll get to later, which contains elements of, as I said earlier, the ability and trait-based models. Baron's model of emotional social intelligence falls under this, and his model is measured then by the Emotional Quotient Inventory, which is now in its second version with the EQI 2.0. So this is a slide that shows you the model of Baron's model of emotional social intelligence and the definition that he has with it. So once again, it's that being able to understand and manage yourself and the emotions that you have, to be able to understand others. He adds in the developing the satisfactory relationship, solving daily problems, and then being able to cope with any challenges that come our way. His model, which is over there on the side, is considered a 1-5-15 factor structure, with a total emotional intelligence score in the middle. And then you can see the bigger around the outside that has 5 composite scores. So those composite scores are self-perception, self-expression, interpersonal decision-making, and stress management. And then under each one of those composite scores are 15 subscales, with each composite score having 3 related subscales underneath that. So for example, under interpersonal, you have interpersonal relationships, empathy, and social responsibility. So you can see the variety of different things under there. Decision making includes things like problem solving, reality testing, impulse control. So just a variety of different subscales underneath those.
So we found, as we were looking at this, Terri found it earlier in her research, and we've confirmed it later as we've gone on, that while there is a large corpus of work in the business world on emotional intelligence, it's actually quite small in terms of what's being done in the realm of librarianship. Just this morning, I took another look. I searched one of the library databases. I didn't write down which one, but one of ours here on campus, and came up with only 40 journal articles on the broad topic of emotional intelligence. So it's something that really does need more attention at the library level within librarianship.
So yeah, so much of the research that I found focuses on emotional intelligence and library leadership. And so as we get in later into this webinar and I start talking about my research, that's where I kind of, because one of the things that I had was an aha moment when I was in, I think, a leadership seminar somewhere where they started talking about emotional intelligence. And as a reference and instruction librarian, I recognize that emotional intelligence would be something, a skill that all librarians should have, especially those librarians who work with the public. And so Building off of, so this was definitely an area where research could be conducted. So promise is one of the, so like I said, many of the studies express a need for librarians, especially library leaders, to develop soft or people skills. Promise examined job announcements, discovering that most announcements focused on the hard skills instead of those soft interpersonal skills, which we know are very important when you're working with people. Promise contends that it's important for library leaders to develop these emotional intelligence competencies. Hernan and Rossiter did something similar to Promise in that they conducted a content analysis of job advertisements for library deans and directors, and then in conjunction with that, they also did surveys of library deans and directors. As a result of their research, they developed sets of competencies in 5 categories. So their 5 categories are listed there. And then under each one of those categories, they have a list of different competencies that library deans and directors or people in leadership positions in libraries should be able to work on developing. Agreeing with Promise and Hernan and Rossiter, agreeing with Promise, Hernan and Rossiter also indicated that library leaders should determine which soft skills are most important for their success and then seek out opportunities to develop those skills, such as the ones that comprise emotional intelligence. And so both Promise and then Hernan and Rossiter talked about emotional intelligence and named it as a particular skill set to develop.
So this list describes some of the competencies for library leaders who are associated with emotional intelligence. Relationship building, you'll find at really, I think, at the core of emotional intelligence, the ability to not only establish those relationships, but to maintain them. And a big part of that is how you manage self. Those of us in Kansas who are familiar with the Kansas Leadership Center would recognize that phrase, manage self, as a first good step in building relationships, whether in your own personal life or in your business and work life. You do need to be able to respond to the emotions of others. In other words, it's not enough to know how you're feeling, but be able to judge how others are moving through their days and how you can respond to them in order to help them move down a positive path toward your common goals. The ability to delay self-gratification, I think that one's fairly obvious, but of course, certainly needed, as is that empathy piece, the need to be able to recognize what's going on with others, identify with their emotions, and be able to react to them accordingly. So Kreitz conducted a study. It's a smaller study, but was conducted with library directors and senior managers. And what was interesting from Kreitz's study was that while top traits were set, those that are listed on the screen there, they varied somewhat between directors and senior managers. The directors themselves needed traits of having vision for the future, being able to articulate their goals, being able to work in a political environment or being political savvy, the ability to motivate people, and also the ability to gather outside resources. And this was compared to senior manager traits, which described a need for cognitive abilities to cope with complex issues, the ability to anticipate the needs of staff and the behaviors that they'll have, being a leader in a shared decision environment, building consensus, being accessible to others, building and leading team expertise, and serving as an enabler in a good way, and as a facilitator. among groups. So it was interesting to me that as you broke out leadership into those two categories, you do see differences. But overall, as you see in that last bullet, it's listening and delegation, having integrity, exercising good judgment, and those good interpersonal skills overall that turn out to be most important.
Okay. As a part of my research on emotional intelligence in reference and information services librarians, I examined the library and information science literature to identify research-based competencies and traits needed by those RIS librarians to provide quality customer service in libraries. Additionally, I interviewed as a part of my doctoral study, I interviewed study participants, asking them about the skills and the traits needed by these RIS librarians in the provision of exceptional service. And although I concentrated on academic libraries and academic librarians, I truly believe this is something that would go cross libraries. So I think the competencies, because I've also looked at the competencies in public librarians, I think the competencies really do hit no matter what library you're in. So whether you're in a public library, a special library, school library, or an academic library, I really think that this fits in with it. So in this slide, I've taken those research-based from the LIS literature and then from my own study, and I kind of mashed them all together. And then I divided them out and put them categorized them under the 5 composite scores from Baron's model of emotional social intelligence, creating a bridge between Baron's model and the EQI 2.0 and research-based competencies and traits. And so I took what I found and what was given to me and tried to then look at where I thought those competencies and traits would fall. And you'll notice that the information that was provided kind of fits all across the spectrum. And so like under self-perception, we have things like being a reflective practitioner, being able to think about what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, being able to assess that and possibly going back and making changes to that. Mindfulness, being in the moment and being mindful of what you're doing and your behaviors. Having that self-awareness, taking initiative, and then lifelong learning came up quite a bit in terms of developing our skills. And we'll talk about that a little bit as we get in towards the end of this. Self-expression, how you express your emotions and express yourself with others, included things like being approachable, being encouraging when somebody is talking to you, guiding people through the process, the research process in terms of finding information, teaching, not only teaching on a formal basis, but also teaching on that one-to-one basis when somebody comes into the library and needs to learn how to use something. And then empowering our users to sometimes, you know, instead of providing them a fish, maybe teaching them how to fish. So empowering them to be able to take some own initiative on finding their information. Interpersonal came up with things like active listening came up a lot, being customer service oriented. Having empathy was another one that is very important. Being engaging and being able to get out of the building and build relationships. So being able to, the ability to work with others. And that not only is true, like I said, in an academic institution, but also in public institutions. Being able to work with your community and the people that are out in that community and looking for those collaborations. So we got collaborative teamwork and then respecting others, which is extremely important in our diverse society. Decision-making included things like analytical skills, being able to solve information need problems as they come to you, but also being very patient. Grit, you know, we talk a lot about grit with college students, but being persistent and being able to continued and try different things. So when you try a search strategy and that doesn't work, continue to try other things. And then looking at innovation, being innovative, not only with how we solve problems, but maybe with the resources and the services that we provide. And then we know that librarians don't have stress, right? So stress management is the last one. Being able to tolerate any stress that we might run into, having a positive outlook. Flexibility. We know that change, the last two kind of deal with change, knowing that change can bring stress. And so the ability to be flexible and being able to move with the changes and being able to adapt to new situations. So all of these are traits that, like I said, the research kind of backs up. And then my own research also provided the similar traits.
So for future library leaders, Martin conducted a really interesting study. It was reported on in 2018, where he collected 318 responses from academic librarians. Interestingly, for his study, rather than giving participants a list of the traits and asking them to rate them or um, label them in certain ways, he simply asked them what they saw as being helpful traits in leaders that had made them positive in the past, and then also what traits that they felt that leaders would need in future librarianship to be effective. So, you know, he started out with just a blank slate rather than a list of choices or a Likert type scale of this is important and this isn't. Very interestingly, from his study, by the way, what you're seeing on the slide here is just another representation. This is more Goldman's representation of his model of emotional intelligence, just to identify that for you. But what Martin discovered was, one thing I found fascinating was 20 respondents out of 318 answered a question that said that they had had no positive experience in librarianship and therefore skipped to another question. I was just fascinated by that. Of the remaining respondents, they found the list on the screen as being those that generated feelings for them that their leaders were positive in past settings. You can see them, I won't read them to you, but emotional intelligence was named at the top of their list. As they moved toward their conceptualization of what future leadership for libraries might look like, you can see again the list there, and you see a lot of repetition in that grouping, but you don't see emotional intelligence named, but you do see a lot of the traits that emotionally intelligent people embody in their work. One other really fascinating thing that, in the interest of time, I didn't want to go into too much, but in our resources, you'll be able to locate and access this article from that we're discussing from Martin. He further goes out to break down the themes that he discovered generationally, finding that for the past positive leaders, there was much agreement. All the items listed fell in the same order for all categories until you get to the last two, trustworthiness and catalyst for change, which flipped based upon whether you were a millennial, a Gen Xer, or a boomer. For future library leaders, however, the lists were quite different, with millennials finding the change agent to be most important, Gen Xers finding a people-first orientation to be most important, and baby boomers also finding that people-first orientation to be more important. But as I said, the categories themselves are quite mixed when you review the data from a generational perspective. So as we think about emotional intelligence and we think about leadership, we need to incorporate that into notions of the organization and its culture. Some of the earlier studies here included a Litwin and Stringer study, which was cited in Machinsky. Um, and Litwin and Stringer's definition is given on the screen here. It's these measurable properties and how they're perceived. So Machinsky tested Litwin and Stringer's original survey, asking questions. So they used a public utilities company as a basis for this, but identified then with comparisons to other research, the ideas of structure, responsibility, reward, risk, warmth, support, standards, conflict, and identity as coming together to sort of create that climate of employment. Shine, who is an MIT faculty emeritus and a noted author on organizational culture, defines culture as it's shown on the screen. And I am going to read that to you because I think it's so important to emphasize certain parts of his definition. And so it says what a group learns over a period of time that as a group solves its problems of survival in an external environment and its problems of internal integration. Such learning is simultaneously behavioral, cognitive, and an emotional process. One really important thing that Shine notes about culture is the leader really does not have the ability to change the culture of the organization. As noted here, it's what the group learns and does over time. So that puts it within the realm of the leader to set the tone, guide the processes, and make the resources available, that sort of collecting of external resources that will allow the organization to flourish and allow that culture to flourish. Going back to Goleman, in his 2011 book, he identifies 6 specific styles of leadership. They're listed on your screen here. You can see a little upward thumb and a downward thumb. An upward thumb for 4 because they are considered to be more positive. A downward thumb for 2 because they're really quite negative and should only be used in certain settings. Of this list, Goleman considers the authoritative leader to be the most effective, the democratic leader to be highly effective or positive. Coaching and affiliative leadership are both considered to be positive, and pace setting and coercive leadership are often misused and can have a negative connotation. Goleman likens the use of these styles to clubs in a golf bag or tools in a toolkit, where each one has its use at the appropriate time, but also with each having its drawbacks. And as Terri mentioned, we will talk later about the fact that it is possible to improve emotional intelligence competencies. And Goleman suggests that doing so will allow you to, choose the right club depending on the lie of your ball in the organizational culture in which you currently reside. So the authoritative leader is probably the most quickly identified with emotional intelligence. That is the compelling, enthusiastic, visionary leader who really wants to bring everyone to charge forward into the future, and does it with great vision. This is generally, as I said, the most considered the most positive of the styles. Um, unless you're working with a bunch of peers or experts, in which case everyone brings equal power to the table. And people might have agendas of their own that they're following. So the authoritative style, while it's a good one, like the others, isn't good in all cases. The coaching style is really better in a one-on-one environment. And it really is for people who want to be coached. If you have someone who is resistant to coaching, this isn't a good style to adopt because it won't be well received by the person that you're truly seeking to empower and improve. With the affiliative style, the affiliative leader wants harmony, wants strong emotional bonds. He wants employees and team members to really feel good about themselves and one another. It's a good style, but because of the fact that it's based on these positive thoughts and ideas, it really needs to pair with another style because, in fact, in the real world, people do need correction, things do need to be changed, processes need to be updated, and we can't always feel good about that. And so I want to put a little note in here about emotional intelligence. And I think a common misconception is that it's about being nice. And in fact, that is not the case. Being emotionally intelligent doesn't necessarily mean you're always nice to people. You may need to take a very firm stance on one issue or another in order to either get your point across or get an important policy changed to correct the behavior of an employee or to make something happen. So EI is not about, always being nice. Another thing I would stress here before I continue with this list is you have to have a capacity for failure. Without failure, um, you're not trying hard enough. I think is it Michael Jordan? There's a famous basketball player who says, yes, he's made this many baskets, but look how many baskets he shot, right? You have to be out there trying. You have to fail in order to improve. So I just want to insert those two thoughts in as we talk about these management styles. The next is the democratic style. This leader listens to others and seeks consensus among all the members of a group or a team or a community. The downside of this style is it's frequently difficult to come to a decision because if you've been to some of the meetings I've been to, there's much discussion and little consensus. So the democratic style is, like others, good in some cases, but not good when data is incomplete, and it's not good in a crisis setting. The pace setting style is one of the two that it has the more negative connotations, although it does have its uses. Here, the leader sets the tone. I had to look this quote up again this morning. It's from Elon Musk, who says, work like hell. You have to put in that 80 to 100 hours a week. And there's more to the quote, but I think that says enough about what the pace setting tone could do for your staff, aside from the fact that it's truly not sustainable. Maybe it is for the few. It certainly isn't for any any organization who's seeking to find a nice balance for their for their staffs and for themselves. It's not sustainable, and it also makes employees feel like they'll never be good enough. They can't get to your goals. It's not achievable. It might be great at the onset. Here's the bar. There's nothing wrong with setting that high bar, but as I said, pace setting in and of itself can frequently be misused, and it's just not sustainable over time. Lastly is coercive leadership, and it uses extreme top-down decision making. It's sort of a my way or the highway approach. it tends also not to be sustainable. But if you are in trying to turn an organization around, or if you need to break habits that have proven to have your organization in a failure sort of a position, it can be used on the short term to help uh, counteract that. So as we think about um, these styles and how they're used and how we bring this all into the library, how do we take the theory and the styles and combine them and create that climate that we're seeking? Lynn, in 2008, wrote a book on, I'm looking for the title, I have it here on my desk. Um, it's interview EQI or interview EI competencies. And hers are listed here, as well as her model for the way that she represents emotional intelligence. I found her content to be really pragmatic and helpful in nature. It's more of